Good morning, y'all. Hope everybody's having a good week, that you're continuing to stay well and stay safe. Certainly, we miss everybody, and I know you miss being with everybody as well, but we're glad you're still with us for our Bible class, and hope this class is continuing to be beneficial and helpful to you as we are still apart. Well, as we turn our attention to the next chapter of the Genesis story, Genesis 37 leads us into the final section. In many regards, we've already gotten a primer to this, in that this past Wednesday night, Marion, in his Wednesday night lesson for our summer series, looked at the life of Joseph. And so Genesis 37 really, as we alluded to at the end of our time together last week, transitions us to the last major section of the story. And in many regards, it is indeed a substantial one. The section on the life of Joseph really covers more ground than the story of anyone other than Abraham. And so it's substantial what we see here in the life of Joseph. And what we understand and begin to see that God is doing. In many ways, Joseph's story is the climax of the Genesis narrative. Because when we think about the patriarchs that we've looked at, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, their stories and their journeys of faith were roller coaster rides that sometimes had really high peaks and at other times had valleys that were lower than the peaks were high. They were characterized by ups and downs and failures. They were journeys of faith that required years to fully get on board with. But Joseph, we don't seem to see those same things. No, in many regards, Joseph is the best example of the faithfulness of the patriarchs. He seems to have had a true and genuine faith in God from a very young age. We don't see the same moral failures that we saw in his father and grandfather and great-grandfather. No, Joseph was indeed the pinnacle, in Genesis at least, of what it looks like to see progressive faithfulness. Now, I'm not saying that Abraham wasn't the father of the faithful. I'm not trying to belittle the example of faith of those others, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But it seems that by this point, Jacob has gotten his house in order. And at least by the time his son Joseph, the 11th of his 12 sons, at least by the time Joseph comes along, Jacob has succeeded a little bit more in instilling faith in his family. At least in his son Joseph. Well, with that, Genesis 37 opens with Jacob in the land of Canaan and being introduced to this 17-year-old boy, Joseph. We see that Joseph was a contemporary, in the same generation of sons as Dan, Naphtali, Asher, and Gad. We know that Jacob had sons over a long period of time. By this point, his oldest son, Reuben, is substantially older than Joseph. And Jacob has had children over many years. And so Joseph is part of this younger grouping of sons. The latter half of them. And as chapter 37 opens, Joseph seems like a bit of a bratty tattletale, a kind of arrogant 17-year-old. Well, we've all been there. We all remember those days. And so chapter 37 opens with Joseph appearing and coming back to tell on his brothers for something that they had done, bringing a bad report of them to their father. But if that isn't enough to put some tension between brothers, because let's be clear, any of you who have siblings know that you really can't stand when your sibling tells on you. That's the worst. But as if that wasn't enough to cause some problems in this relationship, Jacob also played favorites, like his mother and father, and like he had done with his wives, Rachel and Leah. And Joseph was his favorite son. In fact, it tells us that in verse 3, he loved Joseph more than any of his other sons because he was the son of his old age, and he made him a robe of many colors. This coat of many colors has become one of the most iconic things in all of Scripture. We talk about Joseph and the coat of many colors in Bible class. Even in our pop culture we have it. There's a musical, Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. We understand the imagery. The reality is that this is not exactly a great translation. It's unsure whether or not it was indeed a coat of many colors. We're not sure exactly what it was. Maybe it was just a robe with long sleeves. Maybe it was brightly colored. Whatever it is, though, what we do know is that this coat was the type of coat that was only available to the wealthy. It was so ornate and elaborate that it would not have been the purview of just anybody. This was the kind of coat that belonged to someone who did not have to work. And maybe that in and of itself is indicative of Joseph's place among his brothers. That Joseph did not work the same in the fields and with the cattle and the flocks the same way that his brothers had to. This was clearly a display of Jacob's wealth and his extraordinary love for his son Joseph. But all of these things, the tattletaling, the coat, culminate in Joseph's brothers hating him. This is not insignificant. Verse 4 says they hated him and could not speak peacefully to him. You know, we use the word hate kind of flippantly today. I hate pickles. I mean, I do hate pickles. I cannot stand them. I will not eat them. I am not interested in any kind of pickle, period. I like cucumbers, but do not pickle them. And you know, we talk about hate kind of loosely in things. But in the Hebrew language, the word used for hate here was much stronger. This was not some kind of flippant use. It carries with it a sense of presumed action. That there was a guarantee that it wasn't just going to do that, but that when you hate something, you hate it so much that you act out of that hate. And so we see here that when Jacob's brothers hated him and they could not speak peacefully to him, we're being led to believe and to see that what is actually about to happen is something more. That this hate leads them to act upon the intensity of their feelings. Well, as if things weren't already bad enough, then come the dreams, which don't help matters at all. In fact, in both before and after, in verse 5 and again in verse 8, in the telling of the first dream, the text indicates that this made them hate him even more. Even more. Before and after, 2 more times we see this. So now here we are in these first 8 verses of Genesis 37, and we see that Joseph's brothers hate him, and that hatred is continuing to grow at every step. Well, what about this dream could have made them hate him so much? Well, the first dream was one of sheaves. And the sheaves that had been bound and harvested by Jacob's brothers bowed down and fell before Joseph's sheaf. And so what we see here is that in them bowing to Joseph's sheaf, it was clearly an indication of things that would come. But his brother said to him, "Are you indeed to reign over us, or are you indeed to rule over us?" The message was clear. They understood what was being conveyed by this imagery. They got it. They knew what it meant, and they resented it. Joseph was the 11th of the brothers. And all these others would bow down to him, the spoiled brat whom their father loved the most, the one who didn't have to work for anything and got fancy coats. Oh, they were mad now. But then things get even worse. Because in verse 9 it says, "Then he dreamed another dream and told it to his brothers. Behold, I have dreamed another dream. Behold, the sun, the moon, and 11 stars were bowing down to me." But when he told it to his father and to his brothers, his father rebuked him and said to him, "What is this dream that you have dreamed? Shall I and your mother and your brothers indeed come to bow ourselves to the ground before you?" Jacob does rebuke him here for this dream. The brothers become even more jealous and angry. But there is something worth noting about Jacob's response here. Yes, Jacob rebukes him. Yes, his brothers get more jealous. But in verse 11, it ends with, his father kept the saying in mind. This is something we will hear again later in Scripture. Following the birth of Jesus, on several occasions, we're going to see that Mary treasured these things in her heart. She kept them in mind. She did not forget about them. She remembered them. Jacob remembers this dream. And yes, he rebuked his son for it. But he will not soon forget it. And one day he will understand exactly what it meant. Because he kept it in mind. He knows how God works. He had seen God work in his own life. And perhaps he also does realize that in choosing to keep these things in mind, that perhaps it is an indication of the things that God is going to do. Jacob had also had some dreams. He'd had some visions from God. And he had seen by this point in his life the way they worked out. Perhaps it is that Jacob understood that God was doing something more here. Certainly these dreams were not accidental. They were not the kind of random vision that one has while sleeping. No, God was giving Joseph a message. He was pointing to a future, giving Joseph a glimpse to what things might hold. Well, from there our story begins to transition. Because at some point later, we don't know exactly how much later, but at some point later, the sons of Jacob are out with the flocks, tending the flocks. And Joseph was sent by his father to check on his brothers at the city of Shechem. Now this was not an easy just run next door and go out in the back field and check on your brothers. No, Shechem was about 50 miles away. And you can imagine that Jacob was a little bit nervous about his sons being in Shechem with the flocks, especially when we consider what happened the last time they were in Shechem, when Jacob's sons had massacred every man in the city for the rape of Dinah. So you can see why Jacob might have been a little bit nervous about his sons being there, and why he might have sent Joseph to check on him. But upon getting to Shechem, Joseph found that they weren't there. But he receives a tip. He receives a tip that this man found him wandering in the fields. And the man asked him, "What are you seeking?" And he said, "I'm seeking my brothers." He said, "Tell me, please, where they are pasturing the flock." And the man said, "They have gone away, for I heard them say, 'Let us go to Dothan.'" Y'all, a man found Joseph wandering. It was no accident. It was no coincidence that Joseph encountered this man. But he received this tip and said they're on the way to Dothan. Dothan was about another 15 miles or so down the road. But this was a substantial city. Dothan was a major trading port on the Via Maris, one of the most significant trade routes from Mesopotamia to Egypt, all the way to the sea, Via Maris, way of the sea. And so He's headed to this major trading port along this major trade route. And as he begins to get close, his brothers see him off in the distance. He'd have been a recognizable figure. He had on his bright coat. I really didn't think about it, y'all. I put on navy today. This would have certainly been the week for me to wear one of my bright coats while I'm talking about Joseph and his coat of many colors. But you could have seen Joseph's coat from a ways off. They knew who this guy was. And they began to make fun of him, belittle him. They snidely call him, "Here comes the dreamer." Certainly it indicates that while they might have been upset about the coat, the dreams had really pushed them over the edge. But from here we get to the presumed action of the word hatred. Remember, I told you earlier that this word hate carries with it a sense of guaranteed action. That it's not just an emotional response, but an emotional response that leads to action. And here we get the action that that the reader has been supposed to know was coming. Moses' audience would have presumed that as the story continued, this word hate would have led to action. And here it is. They conspired against him to kill him. This is the same word used in the account of Cain and Abel. It brings us back to another moment of fratricide. To talk just about what they were doing. This was not going to be some accidental, "Oh, we were walking and he slipped and fell." No, they were prepared to gruesomely and brutally murder their brother, to take his life from him. But Reuben steps in here in our story. In verse 21, Reuben heard this, and he rescued them out of their hands, saying, "Let us not take his life." And Reuben said to them, "Shed no blood. Throw him into this pit here in the wilderness, but do not lay a hand on him, that he might rescue him out of their hand to restore him to his father." Reuben comes up with a plan that he thinks his brothers will go along with, but without them knowing, he's planning to rescue him from this plan. Now, why Reuben feels compelled to rescue Joseph, we're not sure. Maybe it is guilt. Maybe it is some personal connection to his brother. Perhaps it was knowing that Joseph was his father's favorite son. And after Reuben's own indiscretions back in chapter 35 that we talked about last week, maybe he was trying to get back in his father's good graces, knowing that saving his favorite son from death would have certainly gone a long way to repairing and reconciling the relationship between Reuben and Jacob. Ultimately, we don't know, but whatever it is, the plan was to throw him into a cistern. These cisterns would have been somewhere between 6 and 24 feet deep. They would have been pits dug in the ground to collect water during the rainy season and would have held that water through the rest of the year. The word used for throw him in a pit here, though, implied putting him surely to death. It was the same word that when talking about a person elsewhere in the Old Testament is only used to talk about throwing a dead body into a grave. The idea seems to be that at least to the brothers, not knowing Reuben's plan to save him, what they were signing on to was tossing him as essentially dead into the pit, knowing that whatever happened, he would die there. Well, the brothers do just that. They toss him in the pit, and they went back to eat, seemingly with no guilt whatsoever for what they had just done as they eat together. But as they were eating, they saw a group of Ishmaelite or Midianite traders. Both words are going to be used interchangeably here, which reflects the way that we know that Midian is a descendant of Ishmael. We talked about that several weeks ago now in our discussion of the generations of Ishmael. But these two words or terms and names are going to be used kind of interchangeably by this point in the ancient Near Eastern world to describe the same group of people. But this Ishmaelite Midianite trader group shows up. But even this was no coincidence. Remember, we've already mentioned that Dothan was on a major international trade route. It's not accidental that a caravan comes marching by. of traders on their way to Egypt. Of course they would. That's where they were at. Well, in this, they see this group and they decide that they will sell their brother to the traders as a slave for 20 shekels of silver. Now, the annual salary of a worker, we've talked about this before during the ancient Near Eastern world, was about 10 shekels. So they were going to get twice that. That means that when split among the rest of the brothers, there was lots of money to be made for all of them. Several months' wages worth of money for all of them to profit on from this. And so in our minds, this seems like a lesser evil. That the brothers decide on something that was not near as bad as killing him. But in the ancient Near Eastern world, kidnapping someone and forcing them into slavery was a capital offense. The Code of Hammurabi and other ancient Near Eastern sources outlawed this practice because of how prevalent it had come from the rise of a slave trade in the ancient Near Eastern world. The law of Moses makes this a capital offense to capture someone and enslave them against their will. So to the original audience, what we're talking about is still another crime as bad as murder. I mean, in our minds, we think about murder being the worst, but both of these are offenses that were punishable by death. This is no less bad, except that Joseph lives. It's less bad for Joseph, maybe, but for the brothers, their actions were wrong either way you took it. Either route they went here was a crime punishable by death. Well, when Reuben discovers what's happened, he was visibly upset. He tore his clothes in grief and anger. But the other brothers began to concoct a cover-up. They take the coat, they cut it up, they put blood from an animal on it and make it look like Joseph had been murdered by a wild animal. Oh, the irony that Jacob is now being deceived with the coat by his own sons who used the coat of their brother and an animal, a goat, to deceive their father. The same way, of course, that Jacob had deceived his father. Different way, different story, different situation. But still using his brother's clothes and a wild animal. And an animal to make it seem like something different had happened than had. But even here we see the disdain that the brothers had for Joseph. When they tell their father what had happened, they say, "Your son was killed." They don't say, "Our brother." They say, "Your son." Jacob, meanwhile, was incredibly distraught. It tells us here in the latter verses of chapter 37, verse 34 here. Then Jacob tore his garments and put sackcloth on his loins and mourned for his son many days. All his sons and daughters rose up to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted and said, "No, I shall go down to Sheol to my son mourning." Thus his father wept for him. We don't have the time to talk about what the different meanings of the word Sheol in Hebrew. But suffice it to say, Sheol was a word used to describe the realm of the dead. Whether good or bad, it was the home of all those who were dead. And what it seems here is that Jacob is saying, "I will go to my grave mourning my son." Jacob could not be comforted because he had resolved to mourn the loss of his son all the days of his life. There was no taking away that pain and that hurt. But chapter 37 ends by pointing us to the next part of the story of Joseph. Meanwhile, the Midianites had sold him in Egypt to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard. We don't know exactly what it meant that Potiphar was an officer of Pharaoh and the captain of the guard. But we certainly know that he was a prominent individual within the ruler and the leadership of Egypt. We know that among other things he was the commander of the prisons, as we'll find out in chapter 40 later on. But all of this is pointing us to something else. But as we think about Genesis 37, there are two big things that I think we need to be reminded of. The first thing we need to see is that there are no coincidences. The entire story of Genesis has been a story that's not about Adam and Eve or Noah or Abraham or Isaac or Jacob or Joseph even. The book of Genesis, as we talked about in our very beginning of our study so many months ago, is that it is a story about God. God is the central character. God is the one who is at the heart of every story. And Joseph's story reminds us of that. God is directing every step. It wasn't an accident that Joseph had these dreams. It wasn't an accident that when Joseph is going to find his brothers, a man shows up wandering and tells him where they are. It wasn't an accident that a group of traders come by. It wasn't an accident that he's going to get to the house of Potiphar. All of this was God orchestrating a plan to save the world, including His people, from a famine that was coming, and He was directing every step of Joseph's path. It may seem coincidental, but y'all, this is the providential hand of God at work. I've seen it in my own life. Many of you have heard me talk about this before, but 8 years ago, as Karen and I were wrapping up school, or I was wrapping up school, Karen was already done, and I was applying to grad schools. I applied to a lot of schools. Arkansas certainly was on my list, but it wasn't the top of my list. But it's where I got in, where I got the best offer. And I thought, well, I guess we're going to go to Arkansas. Karen and I had been married for 3 weeks when we moved to Fayetteville. We knew no one. All we had was a grad school acceptance letter and a deposit on an apartment. 8 years looking back, I see the providential hand of God to lead us to this place. To put us in an environment where we could grow, where we could become a family, where we could surround ourselves with family in this congregation, despite being separated from our physical families. And I see the way that God has led us. And right now we're in another period of transition, and I'm not sure what our future is going to hold. But I'm trusting that the same God who providentially led us to this place will providentially lead us to wherever the future may hold. And that's what the story of Joseph shows us. God is directing our paths. He was directing the path of Joseph. He was directing Joseph's life. And sometimes it can be tempting for us to play the what-if game. And this is the second thing I want us to think about. It can be tempting for us to look back and say, well, what if this hadn't happened? And look at the bad times in our life and say, what if this hadn't happened? How much better could things have been? But folks, that doesn't build our faith. We don't become stronger because of those things. The reality is that God is greater than our worst moments. We don't benefit by wondering from what if. Because the reality is that the God who providentially was at work in the life of Joseph is providentially at work in mine and your lives as well. He is greater than our weaknesses. He is greater than our worst moments, and He is greater than our failures. And even when it seems like everything is crashing around us, when Joseph is at the bottom of the pit, God is working. When Joseph is in the house of Potiphar, God is working. And God is working in our lives today. May we be people who, even in the midst of darkness, trust and put our confidence in a God who is providentially at work, who is leading us to bigger and greater places, who is working in our lives to bring about that which is immeasurably more than all we could ask or imagine. Because that's the God that we serve. May we trust Him more each and every day.